Today's presenter is Karen Abel. Karen started writing and researching the Aleutian campaign in 2012 in an effort to honor her grandfather, a World War II fighter pilot in the 111th Squadron of the RCAF. What she discovered was a large-scale lack of awareness of the overall campaign from both an American and Canadian perspectives. Since then, she has made it her mission to retrace her grandfather's footsteps along the way, share the stories of those who have served alongside him in the Aleutian Islands, and soon they get the recognition they deserve. Karen now co-leads a World War II history expedition through the Aleutian Islands every summer, works in partnership with the Aleutian World War II National Historic Area on Aleutian campaign-related projects, including veteran reunions, museum exhibits, and commemorative events. She has always loved aviation and now understands exactly why. She is a member of the EAA Warbirds, Commemorative Air Force Alaska Wing, and the B-29, B-24 Squadron. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen Abel.
So I'm here today to share my story about my grandfather and my plight to follow his footsteps through the Aleutian Islands. But before I start, he's already identified the veterans, and I just want to say thank you for your service. I know that I wouldn't have the same courage that the servicemen had who stood up in defense of our country. And it's because of that I own the responsibility to tell the stories of those who served. So I hope one day somebody also tells your story. And it is hard for me to stand up here, not being a service member, but I'm going to try my best to honor those that I can. So my grandfather was a World War II fighter pilot for the Royal Canadian Air Force. His name was Robert W. Lynch. He flew P-40s in Alaska during the war. And for the last decade, over a decade, 12 years, I've been retracing his wartime footsteps through the Aleutian Islands in an effort to bring honor and awareness to his service, but not just his service, the service of those he served with. Now, I know this museum actually has a little bit of an Aleutian campaign, so kudos to them. It's great to see that. But I'm curious, who knew that there was conflict in Alaska during the war? That's actually more than normal. Like I said, I've been doing this for 12 years. Most people don't know that it actually took place. So the Aleutian campaign started June 3rd, 1942 with the Japanese bombing of Dutch Harbor. And it essentially ended, thank you, it essentially ended with the land invasion of Attu, which was Operation Land Crab, in May of 1943. And a lot of people don't realize that battle was one of the deadliest and costliest battles of all of World War II, second only to Iwo Jima in terms of operational losses that were suffered. 144,000 servicemen from different branches of the military were sent to Alaska to defend the continent. 144,000. And that theater was some of the most remote, isolated, harshest, loneliest of any of the theaters out there. And although the fighters didn't engage in these big, dazzling, exciting dogfights, although there was lethal combat in the Aleutians, what they did face was some of the worst flying weather that an airman could encounter. Low, unpenetratable fog that came from nowhere, hazardous hurricane-force winds, again coming from nowhere, mountainous terrain, lack of emergency runways, uncharted territory, unfamiliar terrain, I said that, mountains, no emergency landing strips. Sometimes the emergency landing strip was 200 miles away. And the magnetic anomalies that plagued the area would throw pilots miles off course, and then only to get over your runway and see it covered in fog. So So this whole journey actually started when I knew my grandfather. He died in 1996. Like most veterans, he never talked about the war. And it wasn't until he passed away that we uncovered several boxes of his memorabilia. Logbooks, photos, newspapers. And I was fascinated by that. Like, who was this other person that existed before that I knew him? And I've always loved aviation. I always had my head in the clouds, but I never had anyone to kind of nurture or nourish that because he never talked about it. On some level, we knew he was a pilot because he had his uniform sitting in the closet and that he wore to his 25th wedding anniversary. He was very proud of that. He still fit it. And he had his medals and a picture of him on the airplane in the den, but he never talked about his service. And my dad was a weatherman. My dad was a weatherman and actually worked at airports briefing pilots on weather, and they never talked about it, which is just, that's so bizarre to me. But now that, after doing all this work, I realize it's very common for that to happen. So now life happens, and now I'm in Florida. It's probably 20 years later, and having a glass of wine with my neighbor who also loves aviation, and we have this great idea, as most things happen over a glass of wine, you usually get great ideas. I said, I'm gonna bring all of my grandfather's stuff, send it to Florida. I asked my mom, send me all of his stuff to Florida, because I wanted to start talking about it and writing about it. I actually was gonna donate it to a museum in Dutch Harbor called the Museum of the Aleutians. Well, that hasn't happened yet, because now I'm too possessive of it. One day maybe. And then I started talking about it to the community, saying, oh, there's conflict in Alaska, my grandfather served there, and people didn't know that it existed. I said, I'm Canadian. I grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And yay! And I'm gonna say, I live in Florida, I've been there 22 years. I've also lived in Puerto Rico, and I work in Alaska, so I've been all around. It wasn't surprising that Canadians maybe didn't know that the Royal Canadian Air Force were in Alaska as a joint effort to defend the continent. But that Americans didn't know that there was conflict in America was shocking to me. I thought, how does nobody know this? 144,000 servicemen, and nobody knows their stories. How is that possible? And so from that moment on, I was on a mission to make sure that these servicemen's stories were told. And that led to this Florida Beaches to the Bering Sea, because I live in Florida and I was on a mission to donate my grandfather's stuff to the museum in Dutch Harbor. I had no idea that this little project of passion of mine would turn into like this massive, heavily involved preservation effort that I absolutely love. So that's my grandfather. Yes, we look alike. People say that all the time. He looks just like my mom, and I'm like my mom's twin. So he was born in Winnipeg, born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He had a Scottish mother and an Irish father, and he was, at the age of 22, he was working at an insurance company, and he wanted to do something to help the war effort, as they all did, right? And so he thought, I'd make a good pilot, and he marched himself down to the recruiting office and pestered them until they finally let him join. He was 22, so he was a little bit old to be joining the Air Force at that time. He was commissioned as a pilot officer in October 1941. His first assignment was to 111 Fighter Squadron, which then was a redesignated 111 Fighter Squadron out of Rockcliffe, Ontario, which is near Ottawa. And they were under the command of Dean Nesbitt, who was a Battle of Britain veteran who came to reform this new fighter squadron that was going to go to the West Coast in the defense of Western Canada. Before they left, though, they had sent the leading aircraftsmen, which is, I guess, airframe mechanics, you call them in the US, right, to the Curtiss Wright plant in Buffalo, New York. And they were getting educated on this new fighter, the Kitty Hawk. We call it Kitty Hawk, Warhawk, that thing. That's how fitting that it's beside me. It's perfect. So the squadron was getting equipped with some Kitty Hawks. All the aircraftsmen were trained at Curtiss Wright. Once they were done, they came back, and Dean Nesbitt, these pilots hadn't flown P-40s, and they were going to go from Ottawa, Ontario, what's the equivalent of that in the US, like Syracuse, thank you, Syracuse to Vancouver Island. And Nesbitt didn't want them to fly. He didn't trust these new pilots to get those brand new P-40s over to the West Coast. And so they, much to the dismay of the leading aircraftsmen, they had to dismantle the P-40s and put them on a train and then train them over to Pat Bay, where I guess Sea Island, and it's Sea Island, which is Vancouver Airport now. They reconstructed them and then flew them over to Pat Bay. And that's where they started their defense of Western Canada and eventually Alaska. So with the rising threat of a Japanese attack, the American air strength in Alaska was seriously weak. They looked to Canada for help. And part of that was a result of a 1940 agreement, the Permanent Joint Board of Defense, which is a binational advisory committee that was formed to defend the continent should it be attacked. It still exists today. They still meet biannually. And one of the agreements was that from all parties, that should the continent be attacked, that we would supply help by air, sea, or land. So we knew that, the Americans knew that an attack was imminent because we had cracked the Japanese code. And the first agreement was Canada allowed the US to set up a naval base on Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert is in the northern tip of Vancouver Island. So that was permitted. A US naval base on Canadian soil. There was not enough room in Prince Rupert to have air defense. And so Canada sent 118 or 115 Squadron to Annette Island, which is about 60 miles away on American soil. So we had a Royal Canadian Air Force Squadron on American soil defending a US naval base on Canadian soil. And that became our official partnership. And that wasn't quite enough defense, because at that time we didn't know that an attack was imminent. That was, they got there May 15th. We didn't know an attack was imminent, but the US knew. And it wasn't until the end of May that we were advised that an attack was imminent, and McGregor and Vice Marshal Stevenson sent another squadron, 2 squadrons, number 8 Bomber Squadron and number 11 Fighter Squadron, to Anchorage. Initially, we hadn't wanted to do that. There was some hesitancy because we didn't want to leave Western Canada vulnerable. So initially, we refused the request to send squadrons further north. But when we found out that there was an attack, clearly we had to respond, because if Alaska was attacked, essentially it would have meant Canada would have been vulnerable also. And so my grandfather was one of those squadrons. The interesting thing about this photo, though, is 2 of those aircraft are still flying. And there's one of them. So that's LZE. and that is owned by Rudy Frasca. Has anyone heard of Frasca simulators? Rudy Frasca is pretty well known in aviation. He created a simulator business, flight simulator business. And in fact, he wrote a book, and I was carrying it through the airport, and one of the pilots stopped me and said, "Why are you reading that? I learned to fly on that simulator." So he's owned that plane for several decades now, maybe even 3. And I was on the way home from some history project, and I got a random email, and I wish I could remember who it was from somebody who said, "Hey, I think this is your grandfather's airplane." I said, "Oh, that thing looks like it's flying." So, a little research, thank God for the internet, and sure enough, it's flying. And I just happen to have a picture of my grandfather sitting in it, same airplane. So I reach out to the guy. First, his sister answers the email, and she's like, "Oh, that's great, thanks for reaching out." And I'm like, "No, I don't think you understand." I don't think you understand what I'm saying here. And then probably several days later, the son reached out and was like, "Oh my gosh, that's amazing." And I'm like, "Yes, that's the response I want. That's amazing." So I flew up there. It's located in Urbana, Illinois. I flew up to Urbana to see it. I got to sit in it, touch everything. It's mostly original. Yeah, even still has the mirror. That one doesn't have the mirror, but it still has a mirror on the top. The way the pilot could look behind him, has a mirror on the front of the canopy, just like a rear view mirror. And then he gave me a little air show. So I stood there in a field by myself, because they have their own personal field. And he flew a little air show for me, just about passed out, I think. It was pretty special. And so we've become very close friends. And in 2018, we were part of a Warbirds in Review Aleutian campaign section, where he flew the airplane down there. He flies, I guess that plane has been going to Oshkosh for several years. So he flew the airplane down there, and us with Ron Fagan, who has a P-40 that has a Bengal Tiger nose, which was an 11th Fighter Squadron nose art. And the 2 planes, and that was a real treat. But the biggest treat was that young fellow that you see in this photo with the blue hat. That young fellow there is Bob Brocklehurst. Bob Brocklehurst flew with the 18th Fighter Squadron, the American 18th Fighter Squadron, and he lived 10 minutes from my house. And clearly we became quick friends. Somebody was getting his hair cut, and he just happened to talk about the war. And I knew his barber, a lady barber, who was in her 80s. And she said, "Wait a second, you flew what? Wait, you got to meet somebody." And she called me up, and Bob and I became very fast friends. Bob made it to Dutch Harbor. We had 75th anniversary commemorations in 2017, and then we had the ATU 75th anniversary commemoration the next year in Anchorage, and he made both of those at 96. He actually flew a P-51 Mustang at 96. And it's all over the internet. He was like a viral celebrity. And there's Bob. So Bob was actually one of the group of pilots to bring the very first P-40s up to Alaska in January 1942. Think about that. 3,000 miles through the Northwest staging route in January 1942. That's insane. But they did it, because that's what that generation did. And they were led by none other than Jack Chenault. Jack Chenault is Claire Chenault's oldest son. And Jack Chenault actually commanded the 343rd Fighter Group in Alaska during the war. After Jack graduated in 1935, he was stationed at Selfridge Field, and was instructed to bring a group of 24 P-40s up to Alaska. And then it was kind of a secret base. He really had no idea why he was doing this, but he did it. How many people knew who Jack Chenault was? Just curious.
Chenault's Flying Tigers?
Jack Chenault. So Jack Chenault is Claire Chenault of the Flying Tigers, his oldest son. Yeah. He was the commander of the 343rd Fighter Group. He was a significant part of Aleutian history. Again, something that people don't realize. After the war, after the Aleutians, eventually Jack did go over to China and serve under his father for a small period of time. I think it was about 6 months. Of those 24 P-40s, only about half of them made it. The rest were scattered along the route. Scattered somewhere along the road. Bob has great stories about like hitting treetops, and he said that all the broken down P-40s were just like part supply for the later ones that were coming up the chain. They flew up there with B-26s, 14 B-26s. They were kind of escorting or flying together, and only half of those made it. And then no planes came up there for quite a while after that because they needed to figure out a better way to get aircraft up there. All right. So once the Canadian squadron got up there, they got up there in June of 1942. Bob's squadron was the 18th Fighter Squadron. Now he was with the 18th Fighter Squadron, because what happened was they flew up as the 11th. There was the 18th Fighter Squadron in Alaska. They got up there in the spring of 1941, but they were flying P-36s. This was the defense of Alaska, P-36s and B-18s. Just imagine that. And so when the 11th Fighter Squadron got up there, it was a really brilliant idea, and I'm not sure if it was General Butler's idea, but the two squadrons separated. They split and recombined. So half of the 11th Fighter Squadron with the new P-40 pilots moved over to the 18th Fighter Squadron, who were flying P-36s, and half of the 18th Fighter Squadron, who were flying P-36s, moved over to the 11th. And each group then taught the others the nuances. One taught the nuances of flying in Alaska weather, because there are some specific things that you need to learn or get used to. And they were able to teach these rookie, I'm going to say rookie, because some of the P-40 pilots that flew up in January with Jack Chenault and Bob had under 8 hours of P-40 time. Under 8 hours, and some of them only had 3. So they were very green pilots. So the squadron split up, and one taught the nuances of flying in Alaska, and the other one taught the nuances of flying the P-40. And so the two of them worked together, and Bob always complained that it was always the senior man who got to fly the P-40s, and all the lower guys got stuck with the P-36s. So that was that. And the Canadians probably should have, that was a big benefit for those squadrons to learn that. It's something that the Canadians, that we'll talk about, that they should have learned from, or they could have definitely learned from. So once the 111th Squadron got up to Alaska, they were attached to the 11th Fighter Squadron, and they were taking operational command by the 11th Fighter Squadron, which was another first time in history that an American squadron was taking operational command by somebody else. All major decisions still were deferred to Gordon McGregor, who was the wing commander, who was a Battle of Britain veteran who had come over to help sort out Western Air Command. And it was really, McGregor really pushed for the Canadians to have more of a frontline role, especially at that time early on, because our pilots had more experience at that time. My grandfather, when he went up to the Aleutians, had 100 hours in the P-40 compared to these rookie guys. Now, they had been there 3 months, but still, some of them were flying P-36s, so they still only had very little P-40 time. And so McGregor wanted them to play a bigger role. You know, move some of the guys forward to the more forward base on UMNAC. And that was granted. So after spending 2 weeks learning US radio procedures, the Canadian squadron moved forward to UMNAC Island, which is about 880 miles southwest of Anchorage. And it was on that flight that they really got to learn the saying that we use out there, that only the best or the blessed survived. Because 5 of the 7 crashed into a mountainside on their way over. The wrecks are still on Alaska Mountain. It's actually one of my goals to get there. We tried to fly over it this summer. I've flown over it once before. We tried to get there this summer, but we got weathered out. It was great when we left Dutch Harbor, which is very typical. It was great. We were flying in 1942 Widgeon. We actually followed my grandfather's flight path from Anchorage to Dutch Harbor in a 1942 Widgeon. And we got to Dutch Harbor on June 4th, the second day the Japanese attacked Dutch Harbor. And so it was a perfect day. Weather looked great. We had it all planned. We did a little sightseeing first. And then we're like, okay, let's head over to the crash site. We're going to land in a lake. And it was a long hike over. And then the weather turned, just like that. We did like two passes over the site. And then Burke said, we got to get out of here. And that's typical. That's typical weather of the Aleutians. So these airmen, 4 crashed into the mountainside, and 1 was never found. We presume that he's lost at sea. Those airmen are buried in Fort Richardson National Cemetery in Anchorage. But luckily for my grandfather, he survived because he crashed the day before. He was part of the original 7 in the formation that was flying from Elmendorf to UMNAC. There were 2 fuel stops along the way. One in Naknek, or now they call King Salmon. The other one was Cold Bay. The other one was Cold Bay. And the first refuel stop, he ground looped his plane. That's it. Ground looped his plane, and that put him on a transport. And another guy had to bail out. George Swallow bailed out somewhere over at Iliamna. That wreck is still there too. He survived. He was picked up by a commercial airline company out there called Star Airlines. So my grandfather on a transport plane made it all the way to UMNAC. And I've always called that his life-saving ground loop. And 75 years later, the story continues, because that is the plane that he crashed on Naknek. It is the plane that you see in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in the Udvar-Hazy Center. Of course, it's painted wrong. Or right, it depends who you ask. But in 2016, my daughter and I went up there to meet with the curator. I had all the logbooks in hand and photos and the crash report, and he said that he can count, he's been there 30 years, and he can count on 2 hands the number of times somebody has come forward with a personal connection to one of their aircraft. It was a pretty big deal. So, and I've always thought that when a plane comes back to life, it's because it has a story to tell. And I feel like I am here to tell the story of those who passed, tell the stories of those who served. Who's seen that P-40, by the way? Who's been to the Udvar-Hazy? Wow, only one few? It's an impressive, I mean, this is impressive too, but that is really impressive. It's their annex that's out in Chantilly or Dulles, I guess. It's impressive. And there's a guy named Ron or Bill Walker. Ron Walker. think he goes by both. He's passed now, and the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum is taking on his work. He unbelievably and meticulously has recorded like almost every Canadian aircraft, civilian and military, and traced that tail number, the history of that tail number. And that's how we discovered that plane, because in his database, he said, just had it there, AK-875. That's how I know the plane, AK-875. That's how my grandfather had it in his logbook. Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. And I went, what? Oh, we gotta look at that. So it's moments like these little things have been happening this entire time. Meeting family members or planes coming back to life that help keep me moving forward to tell the story of those who served. Like meeting Bob. This is Bob and his P-51. This is a Collings Foundation Toulouse Nuts. And my daughter. Meeting Bob, who lives 10 minutes from my house. And we tried so hard to connect Bob to where my grandfather was. Did they ever meet? Were they ever in the same place at the same time? And we just couldn't get there. We could get close. We definitely got close. Like the time when he was telling me a story about he was flying up to Alaska, and they were going to Medford, Oregon. That was one of their fuel stops, Medford, Oregon. And they had to, he got lost. He lost his wingman, and he didn't know where he was. And he saw a little airfield, and then they were using the beam system. And so it made the right noise, and he thought, okay, that's gotta be it. So he landed. By the time he got to the hangar space, he said the whole town would come out to see who that was. It was the wrong airfield. It was some farmer's field. And so he had to, call his commanding officer, which I guess would have been Jack Chenault, and let him know where he was. And he had to spend the night at the farmer's house. And the next morning, here comes one of the higher ups, Al Aiken, in a car. And he says, "You're in the car. I'm flying the P-40 out." Bob says, "No, I want to fly the P-40 out." He says, "You're in the car." They had to get all the armament out of the P-40, out of the wings, just lighten it up because of a very short field. And Al Aiken was the guy who flew it out. Al Aiken flew that plane out of there, and Bob, with his tail between his legs, probably went back in the SAF car. So it was probably about a month later, I was doing some research on a mission that my grandfather was on. This was the first joint mission of the war between the Americans and Canadians. It was an escorted bombing mission over Japanese-occupied Kiska Island. There were 4 Canadians chosen for the mission, and there was about 18 American fighters, combined fighters. There was P-38s, P-40s from the 11th Fighter Squadron, P-40s from the 18th Fighter Squadron, and P-39s, escorting B-29s, escorting B-17s and 24s. And as they got over the harbor, a Japanese ROOF came up to meet them. A ROOF is a zero on floats. So the Japanese ROOF came up to meet them, and this guy was on the tail of an American P-40. And the Canadian squadron leader was named Kenneth Boomer. I should mention that the original Canadian squadron leader, who was a Battle of Britain veteran, died in that accident on the transit over to Umnak. They lost their squadron leader. So he survived the Battle of Britain and died in the Aleutians. I mean, yeah. So the new squadron leader, his name was Kenneth Boomer. He sees this American plane in trouble, so he comes up underneath him and he shoots the P-40 down, or shoots the roof down. He lands in the harbor. The pilot bails out, no parachute. The American lives to see another day. And the guy who was saved, who lived to see another day, was Al Aiken, the one who flew Bob's P-40 out of the cornfield. So I got to call Bob and say, Bob, you'll never guess what, but Canadians saved Al Aiken's life. So that was pretty close. So I now get the privilege of leading World War II history expeditions through the Aleutian Islands. And that's probably one of the most humbling things that I can do through all of the preservation work. To be in that situation and experience firsthand the bounties and the hardships that that area brings is very humbling. And we get to bring family members out there. I started as a passenger on the trip because I wanted to retrace. One of the goals was to get to every airfield that my grandfather landed in or took off from, and just to get to know the area that he served in. And now I get to lead other family members who are going there also. So every year we have at least one or two family members, and I do a lot of research to try and figure out where that family member served and then take them to that exact spot. Our trip consists of flying to Adak Island, which is in the middle of the Aleutian chain. A 737 still flies into Adak. There's about 50 people who live there, but they still get 737 service twice a week. It's kind of fun because you get the whole 737 to yourself pretty much when you fly in there. And then we board a boat. And then we sail from Dutch Harbor or from Adak all the way to, depending on weather, Kiska and Attu, where we get off on a skiff and we hike the battlefields on foot. And then once we get there, then we start making our way backwards down the chain and then eventually end in Dutch Harbor. How many people have been to Alaska, actually? I'm curious. Oh, that's good. Very good. How many people know where the Aleutian Islands are? That's pretty good, too. How many people have been to the Aleutian Islands? Oh, I can't wait to talk to you all. I should point out that we do have the former mayor and longtime resident of Dutch Harbor in the audience, and that's Frank Kelty. Yay. Frank got there in 1970, and so the barracks, all Fort Mears would have been up then. Yeah. What year did they get demolished again?
In the early 80s, they did the World War II cleanup. And they got rid of all the wooden buildings, but a lot of the stuff was concrete buildings. So a lot of the foundations were left. And a lot of the buildings that were utilized by the Native Corporation that were on Native land was deeded over to the natives in the 1960s, I believe.
Yeah,
the Native
60.
Claims Act.
Yeah,
1970s,
60. Yeah.
1970s Native Claim Act. So they renovated a bunch of the buildings and leased them out to seafood companies or fishing boats, people.
So now I'll try to repeat.
Transportation companies.
I'll try to repeat that now. So Fort Mears, which is Dutch Harbor, Fort Mears was in Dutch Harbor. That was the main naval base. Well, Adak became the main naval base, but they built a big naval base, and which is still used today. It has Dutch Harbor has one of the deepest ports of all of Alaska, or all of that region. And so there was a naval base there and an army base, Fort Mears and Naval Air Station, Dutch Harbor, and where they had barracks. I mean, it was fully fortified. And it was still, when Frank got there, those buildings were still up. Since then, they have done a major cleanup and redevelopment of the area, and they've knocked down most of the old barracks. But if you go to Dutch Harbor, you still see pillboxes everywhere. All the gun emplacements are still there. Yeah, you can still see trench lines in the hillsides, which are it's just an eerie feeling. There's still tunnels, like up on Strawberry, there's still tunnels. And
Oh yeah, there's tunnels everywhere.
And you see that all through the Aleutian Islands actually is one of the most preserved battle sites because it's so remote, nobody lives there. Nobody has gone back. So it's a very unique look at base development during the war. And from the Japanese perspective too, because the Japanese on Attu had 2,300 servicemen, and on Kiska they had about 5,000, 5,000 to 6,000. And they were really great base builders. Their underground structures are so impressive and are still structures. Some of them are starting to collapse, but the woodwork, they would haul in all the work from mainland Japan to fortify these underground bunkers that we get to explore. And a lot of there's still Japanese guns there too. So if anyone is interested in that trip, let me know. Let me know. So one of the latest projects that I've been working on for the last 2 years is this book that identifies World War II aircraft of the Aleutians. There were roughly 43 major players, major aircraft in the Aleutians. There were several others, probably about 20 or so others, that played more of a liaison role, which is kind of shocking that most people don't know that the campaign even took place, but yet we just spent billions of dollars trying to fortify Alaska. So this book was published by the National Park Service. The National Park Service manages the Aleutian Island World War II National Historic Area, so it is a federally protected site. And they also manage it in partnership with the Unalaska Corporation, which is the native corporation out there that manages their land that was eventually given back to them. When the war came to Alaska, all of the native land was taken away from them, partially out of protection. To get them out of harm's way, they removed all of the native people from the islands. And the Japanese actually took 45 native people, prisoners, Attuans, and brought them back to Japan, where they waited out the war. Half of them died there. So this book is free to the public. And if you want one, I'm going to have a list where you can put your name and address, and the book will be mailed to you. I have an example up at the front. Now this quote is from my grandfather, and this is something that I found. In the 1980s, the Canadian Department of Defense Directorate of History reached out to my grandfather, the old-fashioned way, typewriter, and asked him a lot of questions about the war. I guess I should have mentioned in the battle over Kiska Harbor, where that Japanese roof was shot down by the Canadian squadron leader. Jack Chanel also shot down a roof. Everyone on the mission was awarded an American Air Medal. Quite likely the first Canadians to ever get an American Air Medal. So that you will see their names in history books. So because of that, the Canadian Directorate of History wanted to know some information about the campaign and had a lot of questions for my grandfather about the mission, how Americans and Canadians got along, who was on the mission, what was their role, what was it like flying up there. And my grandfather, being meticulous as he is, kept a copy of the answers in his files, which I thought was amazing, because it was like then talking to him, getting to hear from the horse's mouth, his own words, what his experience was. And I probably discovered that document about 2 months after I had already started writing about his service and the service of the Aleutians and the service of those others that served there. And after reading that, it really was very clear, because I really am like a lover, not a fighter, if you want to say that. I'm a lover, not a fighter. I'm like, why am I writing about war? It just seemed, different for me, I guess. Stuff would come out of my fingers, and I would say, wow, that was weird. That was great. And I think it's because of this. Can everyone read that though? Is it too light in the back? Oh boy. Okay. So sometimes I can't read it without actually getting choked up, so I'm gonna try. I must say that my service in 111 Squadron is an experience I would not have missed. I feel like the Aleutian campaign is a forgotten about item in the history of the RCAF, and I'm happy and appreciative you are doing something about it. And then I realized that's why I'm doing this. And I know that American servicemen feel the same way. And so know that I tell you and share these stories of my journey and my mission. I say it to you through me, but for them. My most latest preservation effort is starting a YouTube channel, which just goes to show you can teach old dogs new tricks. Because YouTube, that is something for me. I don't know about it, but I sure have learned. And so on the channel is going to be about following my efforts, my pursuit of history through Alaska to honor my grandfather and those who served. The mission that I flew, not the mission, I call it a mission, because I was on a mission. The flight that we took from Dutch Harbor, or Anchorage to Dutch Harbor, is on there on the Widgeon. It's incredible. If you want to see Bob's P-51 flight, that is on there, the full flight. Fox News was in the cockpit. Brian Norris was the pilot, and he had his GoPro in there. So Bob actually did a loop and a roll on his own. That is pretty priceless, because Brian's like trying to tell Bob, okay, Bob, you're gonna do this, you're gonna do that, and Bob just did it. And Brian's like, great, that was amazing. I can't believe you did that. Bob said it was like riding a bike. Bob died 3 years ago, but I'm still very close with his family. And actually, we found a P-40 from the 18th Fighter Squadron that flew. Got up to Alaska in March of 1942, and Bob flew it. So I had just brought his family to go see that airplane, let them sit in it and see what that feels like. And I'm organizing a reunion for the 18th Fighter Squadron for other family members who I know, so they can all go and sit in it. It lives at the Dakota Territory Air Museum. So find me on Facebook, YouTube, follow my journey, but the most important thing that I want you to do is to share any information that you learned today. Share the word. Tell the stories of those who served. And thank you for listening to my story.